They say silence comes in two forms. There is the peaceful, expectant quiet that settles before a storm, and there is the chilling stillness that follows after the storm has passed, taking everything with it. For Eleanor Vance, the silence that now filled her small, quiet kitchen was most certainly the latter. It was a deafening void, a vacuum where a lifetime of love and laughter used to be. The phone, black and silent on the worn wooden table, seemed to mock her. Just moments ago, it had been a bridge to her world, to her only child, Amelia. Now, it was a monument to the end of it. The conversation, if one could even call it that, had been the shortest and most brutal of her 58 years. Amelia's voice, once warm and full of life, had been honed to a sharp, cold edge, a weapon forged in a world of wealth and status that Eleanor could no longer recognize. "Mother, please stop calling," the voice had said, devoid of any emotion. "Julian and I, we need our space. Our lives are just and different now." Then came the click. A small, insignificant sound that severed a bond forged over 3 decades of sacrifice and unconditional love. The sound of a door being slammed shut and locked from the inside. Eleanor did not cry. The shock was a physical blow, a pressure in her chest so immense that it left no room for tears. They were frozen somewhere deep inside her, locked away with the memories of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and whispered promises. She remembered working double shifts at the hospital, the ache in her feet, a dull throb that was always soothed by the thought of Amelia's future. She remembered selling her late husband's watch, the last tangible piece of him she owned, just so Amelia could go on a school trip. She remembered a little girl with bright eyes promising her, "One day, Mama, I'll be rich and you'll never have to work again." It seemed the riches had come, but they had not freed Eleanor. Instead, they had taken her daughter, replacing her with a cold, polished stranger. Staring at her own reflection in the dark kitchen window, Eleanor saw not just a grieving mother, but a woman confronting a terrible, bewildering question. How did the love she had so carefully nurtured become the price of admission to a life from which she was now permanently banned? The storm had passed, and in the devastating silence, Eleanor knew she was utterly and completely alone. But that chilling silence was a foreign country, a land of desolation Eleanor had never known in the long, beautiful years she spent raising Amelia. Before the click of the phone ended her world, there was a symphony. It was the sound of laughter echoing in their small apartment, the gentle hum of a sewing machine as Eleanor mended a school uniform, the whispered secrets shared across a worn kitchen table late at night. Their life together was a tapestry woven not with threads of gold and silver, but with something far stronger, the resilient, unbreakable fibers of a love born from shared struggle and mutual adoration. Eleanor Vance was, by nature and profession, a healer. As a night shift nurse, her hands were her trade, skilled, gentle, and perpetually busy. They could soothe a fevered brow, expertly find a vein, and hold the hand of a stranger in their final moments, offering a quiet dignity when all else was lost. After her husband, David, was taken from them by a sudden heart attack when Amelia was just 6, those same hands took on the dual role of mother and father. She packed lunches, braided hair, fixed leaky faucets, and worked tirelessly, her exhaustion a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of her life. Yet, she never considered it a sacrifice. To Eleanor, her life was a vessel, and she had willingly, joyfully, poured all of it into her daughter. Amelia was her masterpiece. And Amelia, for 18 wonderful years, had been the kind of daughter poets write about. She was a bright, inquisitive child who grew into a thoughtful, empathetic young woman. She had her father's warm eyes and her mother's quiet strength. She understood, with a maturity beyond her years, the weight of their circumstances. She never complained about secondhand clothes or modest birthday parties. Instead, she found joy in the world they built together. She would leave little notes on Eleanor's pillow after a long shift, a simple, "I love you, Mama," written in a child's sprawling cursive that was more precious than any jewel. She took pride in their small, clean home, helping her mother plant marigolds in the window boxes and painting the living room a cheerful shade of yellow one summer. Their relationship transcended the typical parent-child dynamic. They were a team, a fortress of two against the world. They were each other's closest confidant, sharing dreams as they washed the dishes and fears as they watched old movies on their small television. Eleanor was Amelia's anchor, and Amelia was Eleanor's light. There were moments etched so deeply into Eleanor's soul that even the present grief could not erase them, though it now coated them with a layer of bittersweet pain. She remembered one brutal winter when Amelia was 9, struck down by a fever that raged for 3 days. A blizzard had blanketed the city in white, and Eleanor, unable to get to the hospital for medicine, had battled the illness with home remedies and sheer force of will. She sat by Amelia's bedside, a constant, reassuring presence in the dim light of the small room. She bathed her daughter's forehead with cool cloths, spoon-fed her weak broth, and whispered stories of brave knights and magical kingdoms until her own voice was raw. She didn't sleep for 72 hours, fueled only by lukewarm tea and a mother's fierce primal instinct to protect her young. On the third morning, as the first rays of sun pierced through the frost-covered window, the fever broke. Amelia opened her eyes, her gaze clear for the first time in days, and whispered, "You saved me, Mama." In that moment, Eleanor felt a wave of love so powerful it was almost painful, a confirmation that this, right here, was her life's singular, sacred purpose. Then there was the summer. Amelia turned 16. Her friends were all going to a prestigious arts camp in the mountains, a place of tall pines, creative inspiration, and a price tag that was astronomically out of their reach. Amelia mentioned it only once, her voice full of a wistful longing that she tried, and failed, to hide. She never asked to go, knowing it was impossible. But Eleanor saw the dream in her daughter's eyes, a spark of artistic passion that she refused to let be extinguished by a lack of funds. That evening, Eleanor opened the small cedar box she kept on her dresser. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was David's old wristwatch. It wasn't flashy, just a simple steel timepiece with a leather strap worn soft with age. On the back, an inscription, "My Eleanor, my always." It was her most treasured possession, a tangible link to the man she had loved. For a week, she warred with herself. But every time she looked at Amelia sketching in her notebook, lost to the world, the decision became clearer. She sold the watch. The money was just enough to cover the camp tuition. When she gave Amelia the acceptance letter, her daughter's joyful tears were mingled with the dawning realization of what her mother must have done. "Mom, your watch," she had cried, hugging Eleanor tightly. "You shouldn't have." Eleanor simply held her, stroking her hair. "A memory is in your heart, my love," she had said softly. "A dream is in your future. I will always choose your future." Their bond was cemented in thousands of these small, significant moments. It was in the way they decorated their apartment for Christmas, turning their humble space into a wonderland of handmade ornaments, strings of popcorn, and the scent of cinnamon and pine. They would sing carols off-key while baking gingerbread men, laughing until their sides ached. It was in the pride swelling in Eleanor's chest at Amelia's high school graduation, watching her brilliant, beautiful daughter, the valedictorian, walk across the stage to accept her diploma. Amelia, in her speech, had spoken of heroes, and she had looked directly at Eleanor in the audience when she said, "My hero didn't wear a cape. She wore nurse's scrubs and taught me that the greatest strength is found in gentleness, and the greatest wealth is a heart full of love." The entire auditorium had applauded, and Eleanor had wept, not with sadness, but with an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. Her life's work, her masterpiece, was complete and perfect. She had raised a good, kind, grateful human being who understood what truly mattered in the world. Their love was the foundation upon which their lives were built, a bedrock of shared history and unwavering support. Eleanor believed it was an unbreakable, unshakable thing. It was a fortress they had constructed together, brick by loving brick, sacrifice by silent sacrifice. She believed it could withstand any storm, any hardship, any challenge the world could throw at them. She had never once imagined that the greatest threat would not come from the outside, but from a charming, smiling traitor who would be invited right through the front gate, holding her daughter's hand. The first crack in the fortress appeared, as it so often does, not with a violent tremor, but with the quiet, unassuming arrival of a stranger. When Amelia left for a state university on a full scholarship, it was the proudest day of Eleanor's life. It was also the first time their universe, once a cozy, self-contained solar system with Eleanor as the sun and Amelia as the single, bright planet in her orbit, had been forced to acknowledge the existence of other galaxies. The separation was tinged with the natural melancholy of any loving parent, but it was a hopeful sadness. Eleanor packed her daughter's bags with carefully folded sweaters, her favorite books, and enough homemade cookies to share with a new roommate. She envisioned Amelia thriving, expanding her mind, and returning home on holidays with new ideas and exciting stories. She never imagined she would come back with a new architect, one determined to redesign her very soul. His name was Julian Croft, and he entered Eleanor's world first as a voice on the phone, a recurring character in Amelia's increasingly breathless weekly calls. At first, the descriptions were vague, simple sketches of a classmate. "He's in my economics class, Mom. He's brilliant." Soon, the sketches gained color and depth. "We studied together all night. He's actually really funny." And then, inevitably, the portrait was complete, painted in the vibrant, incandescent colors of first love. "He's amazing. He's so ambitious. And his family, they've built this incredible business from the ground up. And Mom, he's so handsome." Eleanor would listen, smiling at the joy in her daughter's voice. But a tiny, nameless seed of unease began to sprout in the back of her mind. Amelia's stories had always been about shared experiences, about we. Now, they were increasingly about he. The day of the first meeting was marked by a nervous, fluttering energy in the small apartment. Amelia was bringing Julian home for Thanksgiving break. For Eleanor, it felt less like a holiday dinner and more like a diplomatic summit. She spent 2 days cleaning until every surface gleamed. She scrubbed the linoleum floor in the kitchen, washed the curtains, and polished the silver plate cutlery she only used on special occasions. She cooked a feast worthy of a much larger gathering, a perfectly roasted turkey, her signature cornbread stuffing, mashed potatoes whipped until they were creamy clouds, and the pumpkin pie that Amelia had loved since she was a little girl. She wanted everything to be perfect, to show this young man that while their world might be small, it was rich with love and care. They arrived not in Amelia's beat-up sedan, but in a sleek, dark gray BMW that seemed to take up the entire street. It purred with a low, powerful hum, an alien sound in their quiet, working-class neighborhood. Julian unfolded himself from the driver's seat with a languid grace. He was exactly as Amelia had described, tall, with dark hair swept back perfectly from his forehead and a smile that seemed professionally calibrated for maximum charm. He was dressed in a cashmere sweater, tailored trousers, and leather shoes, so polished Eleanor could see the reflection of the autumn sky in them. He presented Eleanor with a bottle of French wine, with a label she couldn't pronounce, the gesture so smooth it felt rehearsed. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice as smooth as his sweater. "Amelia has told me so much about you." Eleanor, wiping her hands on her apron, felt an immediate, inexplicable chill. It was nothing she could pinpoint. His smile was wide, his handshake was firm, but his eyes were like those of a surveyor. They swept over her, the apartment, the worn armchair in the corner, the faded print on the wall, not with warmth, but with a cool, detached assessment. It was the look of a man cataloging deficiencies. Amelia, oblivious, beamed with pride, linking her arm through his. "Isn't he wonderful, Mom?" Dinner was a masterclass in subtle condescension. On the surface, Julian was the perfect guest. He praised the food effusively, calling the turkey remarkably moist. But when Eleanor offered him more stuffing, he politely declined with a small smile, saying, "I have to watch my carbs. My family's a bit obsessive about fitness." The comment, seemingly innocent, hung in the air, subtly branding her loving, hearty meal as unsophisticated, even unhealthy. He talked at length about his family's recent vacation to the Swiss Alps, describing ski chalets and Michelin-starred restaurants with an easy familiarity. He then turned to Eleanor and asked, "And you, Mrs. Vance? Do you travel much?" He knew perfectly well she didn't. Amelia had told him everything about their life. The question wasn't born of curiosity. It was a quiet, deliberate act of highlighting the vast gulf between their worlds. The worst moment came when he looked around the living room, his gaze lingering on the handmade Christmas ornaments from Amelia's childhood that Eleanor kept on the mantelpiece year-round. "This is a very cozy apartment," he said, letting the word cozy hang in the air. "It has a lot of character." In his mouth, the words were not compliments. Cozy meant cramped, character meant old. Eleanor felt a flush of shame, an emotion she had never before associated with the home she had worked so hard to create. She felt like an exhibit, a quaint relic from her daughter's past that he was politely tolerating. He asked about her work as a nurse, but his follow-up questions weren't about the human aspect of it, the lives she touched or the challenges she faced. They were about the hours, the pay, the pension plan. He was dissecting her life as if it were a balance sheet and finding it wanting. Throughout the meal, Eleanor watched her daughter. Amelia was radiant, hanging on his every word, laughing at his jokes, her eyes shining with an adoration that made Eleanor's heart ache. She didn't see the way Julian's smile never quite reached his eyes. She didn't notice the faint, almost imperceptible wrinkle of his nose at the sight of a chipped plate. She didn't feel the patronizing tone that laced his every question to her mother. She was under a spell, enchanted by the handsome prince, and completely blind to the cold ambition that lay just beneath the charming facade. Eleanor, a woman whose profession depended on observing the smallest details, the subtle signs of distress or discomfort in her patients, saw it all. She saw the hollowness. She felt a primal, maternal instinct to pull her child away from a hidden danger, the way one would snatch a toddler from the edge of a busy road. After they left, the silence in the apartment felt different. It was heavier. The lingering scent of Julian's expensive cologne warred with the familiar smell of roast turkey. Amelia called later that night, her voice bubbling with excitement. "So, what did you think? Isn't he perfect?" The moment of truth had arrived. Eleanor hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, "He's wrong for you. He looks at you like a possession and at me like a peasant." But she knew it would be useless. Instead, she chose her words carefully. "He's very polished, honey, very confident." The slight hesitation was all it took. Amelia's voice lost its warmth, replaced by a defensive chill that was eerily reminiscent of Julian's. "What does that mean? Polished? You didn't like him." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "No, honey, it's not that," Eleanor stammered. "He just seems from a very different world than ours." "You mean because he has money?" Amelia retorted, her voice sharp. "I can't believe you're being so judgmental, Mom. I thought you'd be happy for me." The conversation ended quickly after that, with a stilted, awkward goodbye. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the feast, feeling a profound sense of loss. The crack had been formed. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. A fissure had opened up between them, and standing on the other side, casting a long, cold shadow, was Julian Croft. The serpent had entered her garden, and he had come bearing the most tempting apple of all, the promise of a perfect life. The wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a coronation. Held at the city's most exclusive country club, it was a meticulously orchestrated event designed to showcase the Croft family's wealth and burgeoning social influence. Eleanor felt less like the mother of the bride and more like a minor, uncredited character in a lavish film production. Her dress, a simple but elegant powder blue sheath that she had saved for months to afford, seemed to fade into insignificance amidst the sea of designer gowns and bespoke suits. She sat at a table near the back of the grand ballroom, a collection of distant cousins and business associates of the Crofts, while the head table, a long, imposing dais overflowing with white orchids, was reserved for the family's inner circle. From her seat, Amelia was a beautiful, shimmering mirage in a couture gown, with a train so long it required 2 attendants. She smiled and laughed, but Eleanor, who could read her daughter's moods like a well-loved book, saw the subtle tension in her shoulders, the slight strain behind her dazzling smile. She was playing a part, and playing it beautifully. It was during the reception that Eleanor met the chief architect of this new reality, Beatrice Croft. Julian's mother was a woman who seemed to be sculpted from ice and ambition. Tall, slender, and impeccably preserved, she moved through the crowd with the serene confidence of a monarch surveying her kingdom. She approached Eleanor's table, a champagne flute held delicately in her long fingers, her smile a thin, blood-red slash that did not touch her cold, assessing eyes. "Eleanor," she said, her voice a low, cultured purr, "you must be so proud. Our Julian has found himself quite the lovely, moldable young woman." The word moldable struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Beatrice's gaze flickered down Eleanor's simple dress. "And what a charming frock. It's simply heroic how you've managed to find something so suitable. It's a testament to your good sense." Every word was a perfectly polished stone, smooth on the surface but designed to inflict a deep internal bruise. In that single, brief interaction, Beatrice had made her intentions clear. Amelia was now a Croft asset, and her humble origins, including her mother, were liabilities to be managed, minimized, and eventually erased. After the honeymoon in Bora Bora, a place Eleanor only knew from glossy magazines, Amelia moved into the Croft mansion, and the bars of the Golden Cage began to close. The weekly phone calls, once long, rambling conversations full of laughter and shared secrets, became shorter, more structured. Amelia was always on her way to somewhere else: a fitting with a stylist Beatrice had hired, a board meeting for a charity she now sat on, a tennis lesson at the club. Her voice began to change, shedding its natural warmth for a more careful, formal cadence, as if she were constantly being monitored. When Eleanor suggested visiting, there was always a polite excuse. "Oh, the decorators are here all week. Mom, the house is a complete disaster." Or, "We're hosting a dinner for Julian's business partners. It's going to be so hectic." Her new life was a fortress of endless, important-sounding obligations. The process of erasing the old Amelia was a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. Beatrice, under the guise of helpful mentorship, began to refine her new daughter-in-law. She would remark casually, "Darling, that turn of phrase is a bit provincial. We say it this way." She gifted Amelia a set of punishingly expensive, impossibly delicate china, a silent rebuke to the sturdy, mismatched plates she had grown up with. Julian, for his part, played the role of the indulgent but firm husband. He would surprise Amelia with a new car while quietly arranging for her old, reliable sedan to be sold. He'd upgrade her wardrobe, donating her comfortable, familiar clothes to charity and replacing them with racks of stiff architectural designer pieces that looked beautiful but allowed for little ease of movement. Each gift, each suggestion, was a transaction, demanding a small piece of Amelia's identity in return. She was being systematically stripped of her past, and in her desire to please her new husband and fit into his intimidating world, she willingly handed over the pieces, one by one. Eleanor felt the distance grow into a chasm. During one of their rare lunches, Amelia recounted a story about a dinner party where she had, by mistake, used the wrong fork for the salad course. She told it as a funny, self-deprecating anecdote, but Eleanor could hear the deep, lingering humiliation underneath the forced laughter. "Beatrice was so sweet about it," Amelia said, not convincingly. "She just quietly switched them for me when no one was looking." Eleanor's heart broke. Her daughter, once so confident and sure of herself, was now terrified of making a social misstep. She was learning the intricate, meaningless rules of a game she had never asked to play, and in the process, she was forgetting who she was. She was becoming a Croft. The final, undeniable proof of this transformation came in late October. The 10th anniversary of David's death was approaching, a day that had always been a sacred, solemn occasion for Eleanor and Amelia. Their tradition was unwavering. They would buy a simple bunch of daisies, his favorite flower, and drive to the cemetery. They would stand before his grave, share their memories, and quietly update him on their lives. Then, they would go for a simple dinner, just the two of them, honoring his memory by reaffirming their own bond. Eleanor called Amelia a few weeks in advance to confirm their plans. "Of course, Mom. Amelia had said, though there was a distracted quality to her voice. "I'll clear my schedule. It's important." But 3 days before the anniversary, Amelia called back. Her voice was tight, high-pitched, with an artificial brightness that set Eleanor's teeth on edge. "Mom, hi," she began, speaking quickly. "So, the most unbelievable thing has happened. The venue for the annual Croft Foundation Gala fell through, and the only other date the new place had was, well, it's this Saturday." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Eleanor said nothing, the silence on her end of the line growing heavier with each passing second. "It's our biggest fundraiser of the year," Amelia continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "We're raising money for the pediatric wing at the city hospital. Julian says my presence as the new face of the foundation is absolutely non-negotiable. It's for the children, Mom." The excuse was as cynical as it was brilliant, cloaking a personal betrayal in the noble shroud of philanthropy. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to tilt slightly. She sank into a kitchen chair, the receiver feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. "I see," she finally managed to say, her voice a near whisper. "Oh, Mom, please don't be like that," Amelia said, a note of petulant frustration in her tone. "It's not like I want to do this. We can go to the cemetery on Sunday. It's just one day." But it wasn't just one day. It was the day. It was the day they honored the man whose absence had shaped their entire lives, the man who had been the source of their quiet strength. To treat it as just another date on a calendar was a desecration. It was the ultimate betrayal. Eleanor didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply said, "You do what you have to do, Amelia." On that Saturday, a cold gray afternoon, Eleanor drove to the cemetery alone. She walked the familiar path, a small bouquet of daisies clutched in her hand. The wind whipped through the bare trees, a mournful sound that echoed the hollowness in her chest. She stood before the simple granite headstone that read, "David Vance, beloved husband and father." She carefully arranged the flowers in the small vase, her fingers numb from the cold. And then she spoke to him, the words carried away by the wind. "She didn't come, David," she whispered, the tears she had been holding back, finally falling, hot against her cold skin. "They have her. They're turning her into one of them. They're teaching her to be ashamed of us, of our love. And I don't know how to get her back. I'm losing our little girl." She stood there for a long time, until the sun began to set, casting long skeletal shadows across the rows of graves. She was grieving not one, but two losses now. Her husband, who was gone forever, and her daughter, who was alive and well, smiling for cameras at a glittering gala somewhere across town, but who was, in every way that truly mattered, just as lost to her. The golden cage had finally snapped shut, and its gleam was blinding. The months following the missed anniversary were a slow, agonizing drift into estrangement. Communication dwindled to sporadic, superficial text messages, hollow exchanges of, "How are you?" and "I'm fine, just busy," that said everything by saying nothing at all. Eleanor felt her daughter slipping away, pulled by a current too strong for a mother's love to fight against. Yet, a desperate, stubborn hope remained, a tiny ember refusing to be extinguished. That ember flared, briefly and foolishly, when an embossed invitation arrived for Julian's 30th birthday party. It felt like an olive branch, a chance to reconnect. Amelia's voice on the phone was unnaturally bright, her insistence that Eleanor attend feeling more like a command than a warm request. Against her better judgment, Eleanor accepted, deciding to bring a piece of their shared past with her as a shield, or perhaps as a peace offering. She decided to bake a cake. Not some extravagant, multi-layered confection, but the one thing that had always been uniquely theirs: a lemon and poppy seed bundt cake with a thick, tangy cream cheese frosting. As she stood in her kitchen, the familiar weight of the flour sifter in her hands, the scent of citrus zest filling the air, she was transported back in time. She was baking a bridge, an edible memory of rainy afternoons spent together, of licking the frosting from the bowl, of a love that was simple, pure, and unconditional. She imagined Amelia tasting it, a single bite that might, just might, reawaken the girl who had once prized her mother's baking above all the world's delicacies. It was a foolish, desperate hope, the kind of hope only a mother can have. She packed the humble cake in a simple white box, a small, unassuming Trojan horse carrying all her love, and drove towards the lion's den. The Croft mansion was less a home and more a monument to wealth. Valets in crisp uniforms lined the sweeping driveway, and the sound of a string quartet drifted from the open French doors. The theme, apparently, was Midnight in Paris, and the guests were a sea of glittering black and silver, their laughter sounding brittle and sharp in the cavernous marble-floored foyer. Eleanor, in her modest navy dress, felt like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a convocation of crows. Amelia greeted her with a kiss that barely brushed her cheek, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Mom, you came," she said, her smile tight. Eleanor held out the white box. "I brought your favorite." Amelia's eyes flickered with something. Was it nostalgia, guilt, before a mask of social grace snapped back into place? She took the box and, without even looking inside, handed it to a passing caterer. "Thank you, Pierre. Could you just find a place for this in the kitchen?" The casual dismissal was a small, sharp pain, the first of many that night. For the next hour, Eleanor was adrift. She nursed a glass of water, trying to make herself invisible against the hand-painted wallpaper. She watched her daughter, the flawless hostess, gliding from one group to another, her laughter perfectly modulated, her hand resting elegantly on Julian's arm. She looked like a stranger from a magazine, a beautiful, polished woman who bore only a passing resemblance to the girl who used to have flour on her nose. Not a single person spoke to Eleanor, their gazes sliding over her as if she were part of the furniture. She was an anachronism, a relic from a past her daughter was working tirelessly to forget. The moment of execution arrived with dessert. A waiter wheeled out the official birthday cake, a towering 5-tiered creation that looked more like an architectural model than food. It was met with a chorus of oohs and ahs. Then, a cousin of Julian's, who had seen Eleanor arrive, asked loudly, "Amelia, didn't your mother bring a cake as well?" A flicker of panic crossed Amelia's face, followed by a resigned sigh. "Yes, of course. Pierre, could you bring out the other cake, please?" A moment later, her simple, homey bundt cake was placed on a sterling silver platter on a side table. It looked small, earnest, and utterly out of place next to the towering confection. It looked like Eleanor felt. That was when Beatrice Croft made her move. Sweeping towards a group of friends, her diamond bracelets catching the light, she used a wide, theatrical gesture to make a point. Her arm swung back, accidentally connecting with the edge of the table. The silver platter tilted, and the cake slid off, landing on the Persian rug with a soft, final thud. A collective gasp went through the room. Beatrice brought a hand to her chest in a parody of shock. "Oh heavens! Look what my clumsy self has done." She turned to one of her companions, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper, deliberately loud enough for everyone, especially Eleanor, to hear. "Honestly, it's probably a blessing in disguise. Can you imagine the calories? And it would have clashed terribly with the patisserie's masterpiece, don't you think?" The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. It was a public execution of a simple act of love. Time seemed to slow down. Every eye in the room, filled with pity or amusement or indifference, turned first to the ruined cake and then to Eleanor, and finally, to Amelia. This was the moment. This was the crossroads. A lifetime of love and loyalty rested on what Amelia would do next. She could have screamed at Beatrice. She could have rushed to her mother's side. She could have knelt and salvaged a piece of the cake and eaten it in defiance. She did none of those things. She stood frozen, her face a pale mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at the smashed cake on the floor, a symbol of her own discarded childhood, and the shame radiating from her was a palpable force. She looked at her mother, not with love or apology, but with a look of desperate, pleading embarrassment. And she said nothing. Her silence was her choice. It was her answer. It was the loudest sound Eleanor had ever heard. Eleanor turned and walked away. She didn't run. Her movements were calm and deliberate, her dignity an invisible shield against the dozens of staring eyes. She heard Amelia call out a weak, "Mom, wait," but there was no conviction in it. There was no follow-through. Eleanor walked out of the marble foyer, past the valets, and into the cold night air, the sound of the string quartet mocking her retreat. The drive home was a blur. The humiliation wasn't about a dropped cake, it was about a dropped heart. It was the public confirmation of her own obsolescence. 2 days later, the phone rang. It was the call Eleanor had been both dreading and expecting, the final nail being hammered into the coffin of their relationship. Amelia's voice was cold, distant, and eerily calm. It was the voice of a stranger reading a prepared statement. "Mom," she said. No warmth, no preamble. After the party, Julian and I had a long talk. It's clear that this arrangement isn't working. Eleanor tried to speak, to ask what arrangement, but Amelia spoke over her. "Your presence, it creates awkwardness. You don't fit into our world. It's just too difficult for everyone." "Difficult?" Eleanor finally choked out, the word tasting like ash. "Amelia, she did that on purpose. She humiliated me, and you just stood there." "It doesn't matter what she did." Amelia's voice suddenly cracked, the rehearsed calm shattering to reveal the raw, ugly emotions beneath: shame, frustration, and a terrible, misplaced anger. "It matters that it's always something. It matters that you come with your coif, your homemade things, and your sad eyes, and make everyone uncomfortable. Just stop it. Stop trying to make me feel guilty. Why do you always have to embarrass me?" And then came the words Eleanor would hear in her nightmares for years to come, the words that would become the anthem of her new, silent life. "Mother, don't call me again. Our lives are just different now." The click of the phone was not just an ending, it was an annihilation. The click of the phone was followed by a silence so profound it seemed to have its own weight, pressing down on Eleanor, settling into the very foundation of her small apartment. In the first few days, she existed in a state of suspended disbelief, her body moving through the motions of life while her mind replayed those final, brutal words on an endless loop. She would find herself picking up the phone to call Amelia about a funny thing she saw at the grocery store, her thumb hovering over the contact photo before the crushing reality returned. After a week, she sent a simple text message: "I love you. I'm here if you need me." It was met with the cold, digital finality of a message failed to send notification. She had been blocked. A few days later, checking the social media page where she used to delight in Amelia's updates, she found only a blank screen with the words, "This content isn't available." It was a modern-day excommunication, a swift and bloodless severing performed with the clinical efficiency of a few taps on a screen. Thus began the years of silence. Eleanor's world, once vibrant with her daughter's presence, shrank to the four walls of her home and the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the hospital. Work became her only refuge. In the quiet, sterile environment of the night shift, surrounded by the steady beeping of monitors and the soft whispers of her fellow nurses, she could almost forget the roaring silence of her own life. She poured her stifled maternal instincts into her patients, fluffing the pillows of the elderly, reading to frightened children in the pediatric ward, and holding the hands of the dying with a tenderness that came from a place of deep, personal grief. She was a mother with no child to care for, a healer whose own heart was broken. Her colleagues noticed a change in her, a new, somber quietness that clung to her like a shroud, but they were kind enough not to pry. At home, Amelia's absence was a constant, tangible presence. Eleanor became a reluctant voyeur, a ghost haunting the periphery of her daughter's glittering new life. She couldn't see Amelia's personal profile, but the world of the wealthy was obsessively self-documenting. She saw her daughter in the society pages of online magazines, photographed at charity balls and polo matches. There was Amelia, smiling dazzlingly on the arm of her husband, her neck adorned with jewels that could have purchased Eleanor's entire apartment building. There she was on a yacht in the Mediterranean, her hair blowing in the wind, surrounded by a crowd of beautiful, laughing strangers. To the world, Amelia Croft was a vision of success and happiness. But Eleanor, who had studied that face for a lifetime, saw the truth in the small details the camera couldn't hide. The slight, persistent tension in her jaw, the way her smile never quite crinkled the corners of her eyes. She was looking at a photograph of a beautiful, exquisitely dressed hostage. Her quiet suffering did not go entirely unnoticed. Her next-door neighbor, a kind widow named Mrs. Gable, would often meet her at the mailbox. She was a woman of few words but deep perception. She'd comment on the weather or the state of her rose bushes, but her eyes, gentle and full of a quiet wisdom, would linger on Eleanor's face. "Long shift?" she'd ask. And in those two words, Eleanor would hear a universe of unspoken understanding. Sometimes, Mrs. Gable would leave a small pot of homemade jam or a few ripe tomatoes from her garden on Eleanor's doorstep. Small, silent gestures of solidarity that meant more than any words of consolation ever could. These fleeting moments of connection were tiny pinpricks of light in Eleanor's otherwise solitary existence. The passage of time did little to dull the ache. It simply changed its nature, from a sharp, stabbing pain to a chronic, low-grade sorrow. Eleanor's life became governed by rituals of remembrance. Amelia's childhood bedroom remained untouched, a perfect time capsule from the life they once shared. The posters of her favorite bands were still on the wall. The worn teddy bear she'd had since she was 3 still sat on the pillow, its button eyes staring out with a silent, steadfast loyalty. Sometimes, on her days off, Eleanor would open the door and just sit on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the faded floral quilt, breathing in the faint, lingering scent of the daughter she had lost. It wasn't a morbid shrine, but a sanctuary of love, the one place where her memories were safe from the harsh reality of the present. The most painful ritual took place once a year, on Amelia's birthday. On that day, Eleanor would go to the grocery store and buy lemons, poppy seeds, cream cheese, and butter. She would return to her kitchen, and with methodical, practiced movements, she would bake the cake. The very same cake that had been so cruelly destroyed at Julian's party. The familiar motions were a form of meditation, a way to feel close to her daughter through a shared memory. When the cake was cooled and frosted, she would place it on the kitchen table. She would set out 2 plates, 2 forks. Then she would light a single candle, push it into the center of the cake, and sing a trembling, quiet version of Happy Birthday to the empty chair across from her. She would cut 1 slice for herself, the familiar taste of lemon and sweetness, a bittersweet torment on her tongue. The rest of the magnificent, hopeful cake would sit on the table for a day, a testament to a love that refused to be forgotten, before she would, with a heavy heart, throw it away. One evening, about a year into the silence, the loneliness became unbearable. Eleanor found herself in a stationery store, her fingers tracing the spines of leather-bound journals. She bought one, a simple, unadorned book with cream-colored, empty pages. That night, with a cup of chamomile tea by her side, she opened it to the first page and wrote the only words that made sense to her. "My dearest Amelia," she began, and then the words poured out, a silent conversation with the daughter who would not listen. She didn't fill the pages with anger or accusations. Instead, she wrote as if Amelia were simply away on a long trip. She told her about her day at the hospital, about a funny joke Mrs. Gable had told her, about how the marigolds in the window box were thriving. She reminisced about their past, recalling shared jokes and forgotten memories. And at the end of every entry, she would write the same thing. "No matter where you are or who you have become, I love you. I am here. I will always be waiting for you to find your way home." The journal became her most precious possession, a place where her love, rejected by its intended recipient, could still live and breathe. It was an act of faith in a world that had given her no reason to believe. The years passed, turning 1 into 3, then 5. The silence became her new normal, and her grief, a constant, quiet companion. She was a woman living in a grayscale world, sustained only by the vibrant colors of her memories and the unwavering love she chronicled in the secret pages of a book. For 5 years, the narrative of Eleanor's life was a story she told only to herself, written in the pages of her journal. It was a simple, tragic tale. A daughter, seduced by wealth, had chosen to discard her mother. The pain was immense, but the story was, at least, understandable in its own cruel way. She grieved the daughter she had lost and prayed for the stranger who had taken her place. She had accepted her role as a forgotten character in a story that had moved on without her. She had no idea that she had been reading the wrong story all along. The revelation, when it came, happened on a dreary Tuesday afternoon in the most mundane of places. The dairy aisle of a supermarket. Eleanor was reaching for a carton of milk when a hesitant voice called her name, Mrs. Vance? Is that you? She turned to see a young woman with kind, familiar eyes, though they were now shadowed with a weariness Eleanor didn't recognize. It took a moment for her mind to bridge the 5-year gap, but then it clicked. It was Sarah, Amelia's best friend from college, a girl who had once spent an entire summer practically living in their apartment, laughing and leaving a trail of empty popcorn bowls in her wake. "Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice thick with surprise. "My goodness, it's been so long. How are you?" The initial pleasantries were a clumsy dance of feigned normalcy. Sarah asked about Eleanor's work. Eleanor asked about Sarah's family. But an awkward tension hung between them, a huge, unspoken topic dominating the space. Finally, as if she could no longer bear the weight of it, Sarah's cheerful facade crumbled. Her eyes filled with a deep, unmistakable sadness. "Listen, Mrs. Vance, this is going to sound strange, but would you have a coffee with me? There's something I think you should know." They sat in a small, generic coffee shop, the air filled with the scent of roasted beans and the low murmur of other people's lives. Sarah stared into her latte, stirring the foam into anxious swirls. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "We should have tried harder. All of her old friends. We should have fought for her." Eleanor just listened, her hands wrapped around her warm mug, her posture still, her gaze unwavering. She had become an expert at listening to silence. Now, she listened to words that were struggling to be born. "The Crofts. They're not just a family, they're a system," Sarah said, finally looking up, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and guilt. "When Amelia first got married, we tried to stay in touch, but it was like hitting a wall. Calls wouldn't be returned. Texts would get short, one-word answers. If we did manage to make plans, she'd cancel at the last minute. Julian had a business emergency, or Beatrice had planned a surprise dinner. After a while, we just stopped trying. It was a systematic, deliberate isolation, and we let it happen." Eleanor felt a cold knot forming in her stomach, but she remained silent, letting Sarah continue. "The perfect life you see in the magazines? It's a stage play, Mrs. Vance. And Amelia is the lead actress who isn't allowed to leave the theater. Julian, he's not a husband, he's a curator. He curates her clothes, her friends, her opinions. I was with them once at a gallery opening, and Amelia expressed an opinion about a painting. Julian laughed, this horrible, condescending little laugh, and said to the group, 'My wife, the art critic. Isn't she adorable?' He belittled her, right there in front of everyone, and framed it as a term of endearment. He tracks her spending on a credit card he controls. He questions her phone calls. He's emotionally vacant. He doesn't love her. He owns her." Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the story Eleanor had told herself. Her daughter wasn't a cruel snob. She was a victim. "And his mother," Sarah continued, her voice trembling with rage. "Beatrice is the warden. She has a key to their house. She walks in unannounced. She rearranges the furniture, countermands Amelia's instructions to the staff, and criticizes everything from the flower arrangements to the menu Amelia chooses for their dinner parties. Amelia has no privacy, no agency in her own home. She's a guest with permanent residency." Sarah paused, taking a shaky breath. "The last time I saw her was about 2 years ago. I ran into her at a spa. For a second, just a second, when she saw me, her face lit up. It was the old Amelia. But then the light just went out. It was like a shutter coming down. She looked over her shoulder, even though we were alone. She looked haunted. She was rail thin, and her eyes were so empty. I told her a joke, something stupid about our dorm room days, and she flinched. She actually flinched, like she was afraid of being caught remembering who she used to be. She made a quick excuse and practically ran away. That's the last time I saw her. A ghost in a designer dress. Sarah's confession ended, leaving a gaping, horrifying void in the air between them. We abandoned her, Sarah whispered, tears finally tracing paths through her makeup. I felt so guilty. I see their pictures online and I feel sick. I thought you should know the truth. I thought you had a right to know that the daughter you raised is still in there, somewhere. She's just trapped. Eleanor sat perfectly still, processing the avalanche of information. The past 5 years reconfigured themselves in her mind. Every cold text message, every missed holiday, every staged photograph took on a new, sinister meaning. Her daughter's betrayal was not an act of malice, but a cry for help she had been unable to hear. The deep, personal grief she had nurtured for 5 years, the grief of a mother abandoned, was instantly cauterized, burned away by a sudden, surging inferno of a different emotion: fear. A fierce, primal, protective fear that a mother feels for a child in danger. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Sarah's. Her touch was steady. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and clear, imbued with the quiet authority of a nurse taking charge in a crisis. "Thank you, Sarah," she said. "You did not abandon her. You have just given her a lifeline." She left the coffee shop and stepped back out into the dreary afternoon, but the world no longer looked gray to her. It was starkly black and white. There was her daughter, and there were the people who were hurting her. The long, fallow winter of her sorrow was over. The years of silent waiting, of writing to a ghost in a journal, were done. The sleeping giant of a mother's love, a force more formidable than any fortune or family dynasty, was awake. She did not know how, and she did not know when, but she knew, with a certainty that resonated in the marrow of her bones, that she was going to get her daughter back. The story wasn't over. A new chapter had just begun. The knowledge Sarah had given her transformed Eleanor from a passive mourner into a watchful sentinel. The society columns she once avoided as a source of pain now became her primary source of intelligence. She scanned them not with the heartache of an outsider, but with the focused intensity of a field nurse searching for a sign of life. She was looking for a crack, a weakness in the Croft family's perfectly polished facade. She found it not in a sign of weakness, but in the announcement of a new, vulnerable life. It was on a Wednesday morning, during her pre-shift ritual of drinking tea and reading the local news online, that she saw it. A headline on a popular high society blog, flanked by a professionally shot photograph of Julian and Amelia standing in a sun-dappled garden. A Croft dynasty continues. Julian and Amelia Croft announce first pregnancy. In the photo, Amelia was glowing, her hand resting gently on a small but definite baby bump. Julian stood beside her, his arm possessively around her waist, his smile radiating not joy, but a deep, smug satisfaction. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. For one pure, electrifying moment, all the pain of the last 5 years dissolved into a tidal wave of exquisite, uncomplicated joy. A baby, a grandchild, a tiny, miraculous being that would carry Amelia's blood, and therefore her own. A new life, a continuation, a reason for everything. She was going to be a grandmother. The word itself was a balm, a healing ointment on a wound she thought would never close. Her hands trembled as she zoomed in on the photograph, searching for the daughter she knew beneath the designer dress and the professionally applied makeup. She imagined the baby, a fusion of the best parts of Amelia, a tiny nose and bright, curious eyes. In that initial, beautiful instant, she was simply a woman overjoyed at the prospect of a new generation. But the moment was fleeting, shattered by the brutal context of its discovery. The joy was immediately pierced by a familiar, sharp pang of grief, this time deeper and more profound than ever before. She was learning that she was to be a grandmother from a gossip columnist. A stranger had written the headline that had just changed her life. Her daughter's body was creating a new life, and Eleanor was on the outside, looking in through a dirty window, just like the rest of the world. She would not be there to celebrate, to offer advice, to soothe Amelia's fears. She would not be invited to the baby shower. She would not feel the baby kick. She would not be in the hospital waiting room, pacing with nervous excitement. The milestones that were the sacred right of a grandmother were being denied to her, and the injustice of it was a physical ache in her chest. Then, a third, more powerful emotion surged, eclipsing both the joy and the sorrow. It was the fierce, cold clarity of a protector. Sarah's words echoed in her mind. A warden, a curator, a ghost in a designer dress. She looked at the photograph again, her nurse's eyes now performing a clinical assessment. She saw Julian smile for what it was, the look of a man who had just secured a priceless acquisition. She saw Amelia's glow not as the radiance of a happy mother-to-be, but as the flawless, artificial sheen of a woman performing her most important role to date. And she thought of the innocent, helpless baby growing inside her daughter, a baby being born not into a family but into a dynasty. A child who would be seen not as a soul to be nurtured, but as an heir to be molded. Her fears were confirmed as she read the accompanying article. It was filled with quotes from an unnamed source close to the family, whose voice Eleanor recognized with chilling certainty as Beatrice Croft's. The source spoke not of a baby, but of a legacy. The Croft family is, of course, delighted, the article read. They are eager to welcome the next generation, who will be instrumental in continuing the family's vast philanthropic and business endeavors. There was no mention of love, only of duty. The article went on to detail the lavish preparations. A renowned interior designer from Los Angeles had been flown in to create a bespoke, state-of-the-art nursery. The unborn child was already on the waiting list for the city's most exclusive preschool, a place where tuition rivaled a university education. They were building a perfect gilded cage for a baby that had not yet taken its first breath. That afternoon, Eleanor left the hospital, and instead of going straight home, she walked to a small, unassuming yarn shop downtown. The store was a riot of color and texture, a quiet, warm place that smelled of wool and cedar. She ran her hands over skeins of cashmere and silk, but she wasn't looking for the most expensive. She was looking for the softest. She settled on a merino wool, the color of pale, buttery sunshine, a gentle, hopeful color that was neither for a boy nor a girl, but simply for a baby. That evening, as the city lights began to twinkle outside her window, Eleanor cast the first stitches onto her knitting needles, and with that simple, repetitive motion, she began her rebellion. The click-clack of the needles was a quiet, steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the loud, empty pronouncements of the Crofts. They could hire designers and secure preschool placements, but they could not do this. They could not weave love into every loop and knot. As she knitted, her purpose, which had been a formless, desperate thing since her conversation with Sarah, now took on a sharp, clear focus. This was no longer just about rescuing her daughter from a cold marriage. It was about saving her grandchild from a cold life. It was about ensuring that this new soul would have at least one tangible link to a world of unconditional, uncomplicated love. The blanket grew night after night, a soft, warm square of sunshine in her lap. It was a prayer, a promise, a tangible piece of her heart. She knit in her hopes for the child's happiness, her dreams of a life filled with laughter and scraped knees and finger painting, not board meetings and charity galas. She was creating a shield, an amulet, a flag of surrender that she hoped her daughter would one day have the strength to raise. Weeks turned into months. The silence from Amelia's side remained absolute, but Eleanor's world was no longer silent. It was filled with the gentle, rhythmic sound of her needles, a sound that was both a meditation and a quiet declaration of war. When the blanket was finally finished, she washed it by hand with gentle soap until it was impossibly soft. She folded it with the reverence of a priest folding a sacred cloth and placed it inside a simple, clean white box. She tied the box with a white ribbon and placed it on the top shelf of her closet. It was an act of faith. It was a weapon of love, waiting patiently for the moment it would be needed. The news of the baby had been a brutal, double-edged sword, but it had given Eleanor something she had been starved of for 5 long years. A fragile but fierce glimmer of hope. The arrival of the Croft heir was announced to the world not with a joyful, candid snapshot, but through a formal press release distributed by a public relations firm. Eleanor read the sterile, carefully worded statement online. Julian and Amelia Croft are pleased to announce the birth of their daughter, Liliana Grace Croft, born at 7:02 a.m., weighing 6 pounds, 2 ounces. Mother and child are resting comfortably. Liliana Grace. It was a name that sounded like a legal trust, a name destined for engraving on silver cups and charity plaques. In the quiet of her own heart, Eleanor gave the baby a different name, a secret, whispered name full of love. Lily. For the first few days, the curated narrative held. The society blogs posted archival photos of the happy couple, speculating on how Liliana would be the best-dressed baby in the city. But reality, messy and uncooperative, soon refused to follow the script. Little Lily was born with a severe case of colic and silent reflux, a non-life-threatening but agonizing combination of ailments. Her tiny digestive system was a knot of constant pain, making it difficult for her to feed and impossible for her to settle. She wasn't the placid, gurgling accessory the Crofts had been expecting. She was a tiny, fragile being in a state of perpetual, piercing distress. Her cries, high-pitched and relentless, shattered the cathedral-like silence of the Croft mansion. This imperfection was a crack in the family's veneer of flawlessness, and they did not react with compassion, but with profound irritation. Julian treated his daughter's crying as a personal affront, a defect in a recently acquired luxury good. He would stand in the doorway of the multi-$1,000 designer nursery, a frown creasing his handsome face. "Have you tried a different formula?" he'd ask Amelia, his tone that of a CEO addressing an underperforming subordinate. "There are consultants for this sort of thing. We should hire the best." He never offered to hold his screaming daughter. The noise grated on his nerves, disrupting the placid, orderly world he had built for himself. The late nights at the office became later, the weekend golf games longer. He retreated from the sound, and from his wife and child. Beatrice's reaction was even colder. She would visit, her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval, and survey the scene with the critical eye of a health inspector. "None of the Croft babies were ever like this," she commented to Amelia one afternoon, over the sound of Lily's wails. "We were always such calm, contented infants. It must be a sensitivity from your side of the family." She offered no comfort, no help, only a thinly veiled accusation, a suggestion that Amelia's inferior lineage had produced a flawed product. The Croft solution to any problem was to throw money at it. They hired a series of highly credentialed, exorbitantly expensive night nurses. The first, a stern woman with impeccable references, lasted 4 nights before declaring that the child was unusually difficult and that the family's expectations were unrealistic. The second, a younger, warmer woman, managed to find a specific way of holding Lily that sometimes calmed her, but Beatrice fired her after a week, accusing her of undermining the mother's authority. The third quit in a flood of exhausted tears after a sleepless, 72-hour stretch. The revolving door of hired help left Amelia in a state of constant whiplash and ultimately in a state of total isolation. Her postpartum recovery was brutal, but it was the descent into the gray, suffocating fog of postpartum depression that truly unmoored her. The magnificent mansion, once a symbol of her elevated status, became her prison. The sound of Lily's crying echoed through the cavernous, empty rooms, amplifying her own despair. Days and nights bled into one another, a monotonous, sleepless cycle of feeding, frantic rocking, and inconsolable screaming. She would walk the plush carpets of the long hallways for hours, her baby clutched to her chest, both of them crying. The reflection that stared back at her from the gilded mirrors was a stranger, a hollow-eyed, wild-haired woman with milk stains on her silk pajamas, a ghost haunting the opulent set of her own life. She loved her daughter with a fierce, primal intensity, but in her darkest, most exhausted moments, a terrifying resentment would flicker within her, a feeling of being trapped and suffocated, which was always followed by a tidal wave of crushing, debilitating guilt. How could she feel that way about her own child? What kind of a mother was she? Beatrice's words echoed in her mind. Flawed. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week, during a ferocious thunderstorm that mirrored the tempest in her own soul. The latest nanny had quit that morning. Julian was stuck in a dinner meeting. Beatrice was not answering her phone. Amelia was alone. Lily had been screaming for 6 hours straight, her tiny body rigid with pain, her face a crumpled red mask of misery. Amelia had tried everything: a warm bath, a change of clothes, a different formula, a drive in the car through the rain-slicked streets. Nothing worked. The cries bored into her skull, fraying her last nerve until it was a raw, exposed wire. At 3 a.m, she sank to the floor of the nursery, the screaming baby in her arms. The room, with its hand-painted murals of woodland creatures and its cashmere throws, seemed to mock her with its serene, sterile perfection. And as a deafening clap of thunder rattled the windows, Amelia broke. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, animal sound of pure, unadulterated despair. She wept for her own pain, for her baby's pain, for the catastrophic, gilded mistake her life had become. The money, the status, the parties, the perfect husband, it was all a lie, an elaborate, empty illusion. None of it mattered. None of it could help her here, on this floor, at 3 a.m, with a suffering child in her arms. In this moment of absolute, soul-crushing clarity, she realized she had traded the one thing of real value in her life for a world of glittering, worthless trash. She had traded away the one person whose love was not conditional, whose presence was a guarantee of comfort and safety. As Lily's cries continued to pierce the air, a name, a feeling, a desperate, primal need rose up from the depths of her brokenness. She didn't just want her mother, she needed her. She needed her mother's calm, capable hands, her soft voice, her boundless well of quiet strength that could make any storm feel manageable. The realization was so powerful. It was a physical craving, an ache for a home she had willingly, foolishly, burned to the ground. She sat there on the floor for a long time, the storm raging both outside and in, her tears mingling with her daughter's, a shared symphony of misery. The golden cage had never felt colder or smaller, but in the deepest pit of her despair, a tiny, forgotten instinct flickered to life. The instinct of a lost child who finally, desperately, wants to find her way home. The breaking point was not a single, clean snap, but a slow, agonizing disintegration into dust. Huddled on the nursery floor, with the storm outside and the storm in her arms raging in a terrifying duet, Amelia felt the last vestiges of her carefully constructed identity crumble away. The polished, perfect Mrs. Julian Croft dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, lonely girl who was failing at the one thing that was supposed to matter. The sound of Lily's cries was no longer just a sound. It was the voice of her own failure, a relentless, piercing accusation. In the abyss of her despair, a single flickering memory surfaced. Her mother's hands, cool and capable, on her feverish forehead as a child. Her mother's voice, a soft, steady anchor in the dark. A desperate, primal need, more powerful than shame, more urgent than fear, took hold of her. She had to make the call. With a surge of numb, desperate energy, she placed the screaming Lily back into her gilded crib. She moved with a strange, quiet purpose, a sleepwalker navigating a nightmare. She went to her cavernous walk-in closet, a room the size of her mother's entire living room, filled with rows of designer clothes that felt like costumes for a stranger. She ignored the silk and cashmere, pushing past racks of unworn dresses until she reached the back. There, on a dusty shelf, was an old canvas tote bag from her college days, a relic from a life she no longer recognized. Julian had once called it appallingly pedestrian. Inside, tucked into a side pocket, was a cheap, plastic-wrapped, prepaid phone. A burner phone. She had bought it 3 years ago, on a rare solo trip to a pharmacy, in a moment of subconscious foresight she hadn't understood at the time. It was a tiny, secret act of self-preservation, a key to an escape hatch she never thought she'd need. She fumbled with the packaging, her trembling fingers tearing at the plastic. She powered it on, the cheap, bright screen illuminating her tear-streaked face. There was no contact list, no history, just a blank slate. She took a deep, shuddering breath and punched in the 10 digits that were etched into her soul, a number she had recited to herself in the lonely darkness of many nights, a secret rosary of a faith she thought she had lost. The phone began to ring, the electronic tone sounding impossibly loud in the silent mansion. 1 ring. 2. Her courage faltered. She won't answer. Or she will, and she'll hang up. She'll tell me I deserve this. The shame was a physical weight, threatening to crush her. She was about to disconnect when, on the 3rd ring, the line clicked open. In her small apartment across town, Eleanor was in bed, propped up against the pillows, writing in her journal. The cheap cell phone on her nightstand, a number reserved for emergencies, suddenly buzzed to life. The screen read, "Unknown number." Her first thought was that it was a telemarketer, a wrong number, but it was after 3 in the morning. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. A nurse's instinct, a mother's intuition, told her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice cautious. For a moment, there was only the sound of ragged, desperate breathing, and in the background, the unmistakable, piercing cry of a baby in distress. Then, a choked, broken sob. Eleanor sat bolt upright in bed, her heart seizing in her chest. She knew that sound. She would know it anywhere. "Amelia?" she breathed. The name was a prayer, a question, a plea. "Mama." The voice was a raw, shredded thing, a sound of utter brokenness. I'm so sorry. Oh God, Mama, I'm so sorry. Please, you have to help me." The baby. She won't stop crying. "I don't know what to do. Please help me." In that instant, 5 years of pain, of silence, of aching loneliness did not matter. The journal on her lap, filled with letters to a daughter who had abandoned her, did not matter. The ruined cake, the missed anniversary, the cruel, final words, all of it was incinerated in a fierce, brilliant flash of pure, unconditional love. There was no hesitation. There was no anger. There was only a mother hearing her child's cry in the dark. Her voice, when she spoke, was a lifeline of calm in a sea of chaos. "Amelia, listen to my voice. It's okay. I'm here. Tell me where you are. I'm coming right now. I need..." She threw on the jeans and sweater that were draped over a chair, her movements swift and efficient. She grabbed her keys, her purse, her worn nurse's clogs. As she drove her old, reliable car through the rain-lashed, deserted streets, the city lights streaking across her windshield, her mind was a place of absolute clarity. There was no room for the past. There was no thought of, "I told you so." There was only the mission. A primal, singular focus that had been dormant for half a decade was now fully, fiercely awake. The steady, rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers was a countdown, each swipe bringing her closer to her child, her grandchild. She was no longer waiting. She was no longer grieving. She was a mother on her way to a rescue. The massive, wrought-iron gates of the Croft estate loomed out of the darkness, a symbol of the power and wealth that had stolen her daughter. And there, standing just inside them, was a scene of such raw, human misery that it took Eleanor's breath away. Amelia stood in the pouring rain, her thin pajamas soaked through, her hair plastered to her skull. In her arms, she clutched a tiny, writhing bundle, the source of the frantic, exhausted cries that Eleanor could now hear clearly. The gate was unlocked, pushed open just enough for a person to slip through. Eleanor slammed the car into park and ran. The reunion was not one of words, but of a desperate, primal collision. Amelia collapsed into her mother's arms, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry," she chanted into Eleanor's shoulder, the words a litany of pain and regret. Eleanor just held her, stroking her wet hair, shielding her from the rain with her own body. "Shh, it's okay, my baby," she whispered, the old, familiar endearment slipping out as naturally as breathing. "It's all okay now. Mama's here." She gently pulled back, her eyes, full of a fierce and tender love, taking in her daughter's ravaged face, and then the screaming, red-faced infant in her arms. She looked at the tiny, miserable creature, and her heart, which had been broken for so long, seemed to crack open again, this time to let in a love so powerful, it was overwhelming. "Oh, you poor, sweet thing," she murmured. She held out her arms. "Amelia, give her to me." With a gasp of profound, bone-deep relief, as if she were handing over a burden too heavy to carry another second, Amelia transferred her daughter into her mother's arms. The three of them stood there for a moment, huddled together in the rain, a tiny, defiant island of love against the backdrop of the cold, dark, silent mansion. Eleanor, her arms wrapped around her broken daughter, her hands now expertly soothing her crying grandchild. The storm raged on, but inside their small, desperate circle, a fragile calm had finally begun to descend. The silence had been broken. The return was complete. Eleanor stepped across the threshold of the Croft mansion, not as an intruder, but as a medic entering a crisis zone. She led her broken daughter inside, out of the rain, and into the cavernous, marble-floored foyer. The house was just as she had imagined it from the society pages, impossibly grand, impeccably decorated, and as cold and silent as a mausoleum. The only sound was the relentless, heartbreaking cry of the baby in her arms. Amelia, shivering and in a state of shock, seemed lost in her own home, but Eleanor's focus was singular and absolute. "Where is the kitchen?" she asked, her voice calm and steady, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. She ignored the designer furniture and the imposing works of art, heading straight for a vast, stainless steel kitchen that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. The room was sterile and spotless. It was clear no one ever actually cooked in it. With the practiced efficiency of a nurse who has handled 1,000 crises, Eleanor began her work. She tested the temperature of the formula in a pre-filled bottle, finding it ice cold from the refrigerator. She gently warmed it under the tap, her movements economical and sure. Amelia watched, hovering nearby, a look of awe and shame on her face as she witnessed the simple, confident competence she had forsaken for so long. But it wasn't the warm milk that would perform the miracle. It was something far more elemental. After ensuring Lily had taken a few sips, Eleanor sat down in a starkly modern chair, adjusting the tiny, rigid body against her own. She held the baby upright against her shoulder, her hand warm and firm on the tiny back, and began to rock with a slow, deep, hypnotic rhythm. It was a rhythm as old as time itself. And then she began to hum. It was a simple, tuneless lullaby, the same one she had hummed to Amelia 30 years ago, a wordless melody of pure, unconditional love. In the vast, cold kitchen, under the glare of recessed lighting, this simple human act was a profound rebellion. Lily, who had only known frantic, anxious handling and the cold indifference of hired help, seemed to instinctively recognize the difference. Her piercing screams began to subside, replaced by ragged, exhausted whimpers. Her tense little body, which had been bored stiff with pain, slowly began to relax, melting into the warmth of her grandmother's embrace. A few minutes later, a tiny, shuddering sigh escaped her lips. And then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was silence. A peaceful, blessed silence. Lily was asleep. Amelia stared, tears streaming silently down her face. In that quiet moment, the entire artifice of her life was exposed as a fraudulent, empty sham. All the money, all the status, all the designer nurseries and expert consultants in the world had failed to achieve what her mother, with nothing more than her own 2 hands and a loving heart, had accomplished in under an hour. It was a revelation so profound it was like waking from a long and terrible dream. The quiet was shattered by the sound of the front door slamming open. Julian stood in the archway to the kitchen, his suit immaculate, his face a thunderous mask of rage. Behind him, having clearly been summoned by a frantic text message, was Beatrice Croft, her expression one of pure venom. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian hissed, his voice dangerously low. He didn't look at Eleanor. He directed his fury entirely at Amelia, his eyes boring into her as if she were a traitor. "What is she doing in my house?" Beatrice stepped forward, her voice like the shattering of ice. "Amelia, have you taken leave of your senses? After the utter humiliation she caused at your husband's birthday? You will tell this woman to leave. This instant." Amelia stood frozen between them, a deer caught in the headlights. She looked at her husband's contorted face, at her mother-in-law's sneer, and then she looked at her mother. Eleanor had not flinched. She sat calmly, a fierce, protective stillness about her, her sleeping grandchild nestled safely in her arms. She met Amelia's gaze, and in her eyes there was no fear, no judgment, only a deep, quiet well of strength and unconditional love. It was a look that said, "You are not alone." I am here. That look was all it took. The spell was broken. The fear that had governed Amelia's life for 5 years evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear, liberating anger. She straightened her shoulders, and for the first time, she did not shrink under her husband's glare. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the timid whisper of a frightened girl, but the steady, resonant voice of a woman who had finally found her footing. No. The single word hung in the air, a shocking act of defiance. Julian stared, momentarily stunned into silence. Her name, Amelia continued, her voice gaining strength, is Eleanor. She is my mother. And this, she gestured to the sleeping baby, is her granddaughter, Lily. For weeks, the two of you have watched me fall apart. You have watched my daughter suffer. You have criticized and complained and offered nothing but judgment. In less than 1 hour, my mother has given my child more comfort and love than either of you have shown in her entire life. She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. This is my family, my real family, and if you cannot treat them with respect, then this is not my home. The transformation was absolute. Julian, seeing his authority challenged, his perfect control slipping, lost what little composure he had left. His face turned a blotchy, ugly red. Your home? He bellowed, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. You have nothing. I gave you everything. You are nothing without my name, without my money. I bought every dress on your back. I paid for the face you see in the mirror. You ungrateful little pauper. He took a step towards her, his rage making him reckless, his mask of sophistication completely shattered. You think you can just walk out of here? Back to your mother's pathetic little hovel? I should have known you could never truly escape the gutter you came from. It was a mistake, all of it. A beautiful, empty-headed mistake. Just like my affair with Christine at the office is a mistake, but at least she's smart enough to be grateful, and she doesn't spend all her time with a screaming brat. The ugly confession, spat out in a torrent of pure, narcissistic rage, hung in the air, more shocking than the sound of a gunshot. Beatrice looked horrified, not at her son's infidelity, but at his catastrophic lack of discretion. It was a vulgar, common scene, an unforgivable social sin. But Amelia did not cry. She did not scream. She simply looked at the man she had once loved, the man for whom she had sacrificed everything, and she felt nothing. No pain, no heartbreak, only the cold, liberating peace of a truth finally, irrevocably revealed. The last chain had been broken. She turned her back on him and on the ruins of their life together and looked at her mother. Her voice was quiet, but clear. Mom, can we go home now? Eleanor, the calm, steady anchor in the heart of the storm, looked at her daughter, a slow, gentle smile gracing her lips for the first time that night. She stood up, holding the sleeping Lily securely in her arms. Yes, my darling, she said. Let's go home. And together, the three of them walked out, leaving Julian and Beatrice standing speechless in the cold, opulent wreckage of their perfect, empty world. Walking out of that cold, marble tomb and into the pre-dawn air was like taking a first breath. In the car, driving away from the imposing gates of the Croft estate for the last time, a new kind of silence settled between them. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of estrangement, but a quiet, shared peace of utter exhaustion and profound relief. The storm had passed, and in the rearview mirror, Amelia watched the mansion, a monument to her gilded captivity, shrink and finally disappear into the gray light of a new day. She was carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the sleeping child in her arms, and yet, for the first time in 5 years, she felt impossibly, miraculously rich. The reckoning for the Crofts was not a dramatic public affair, but a quiet internal collapse. Amelia's divorce proceedings were swift. Guided by her mother's unwavering calm, she asked for nothing. No alimony, no settlement, no property. She wanted only 2 things, her daughter and her maiden name. To Julian, a man who understood the world only in terms of transactions and acquisitions, this was the ultimate, incomprehensible insult. He could not comprehend a person walking away from a fortune. Her refusal to fight for his money was a declaration that it, and by extension, he, had no value. Stripped of his perfect family facade and exposed by his own raging admission of infidelity, he was left to navigate the social fallout, his reputation permanently tarnished by the vulgarity of his own meltdown. He and Beatrice were left exactly as they had always been, alone together in their vast, empty fortress, surrounded by priceless objects and a worthless, hollow love. Their punishment was not a loss of wealth, but the stark, undeniable revelation of their own spiritual poverty. A few weeks later, the three generations had settled into a new rhythm in Eleanor's small, warm apartment. The little home, which had once seemed cramped and embarrassing to Amelia, now felt like a sanctuary. But as the adrenaline of her escape faded, the terrifying reality of their situation began to set in. One evening, as she watched her mother gently rock a finally peaceful Lily to sleep, Amelia's composure broke. "Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "What have I done to you? I walked away with nothing. I have no job, no money. I've dragged you and Lily into poverty with me. How are we ever going to manage?" Eleanor gently placed the sleeping baby in the old wooden crib in the corner of the living room. She turned to her daughter, her expression soft and serene. She walked to the small cedar box on her dresser, the same box that had once held her husband's watch. From it, she removed not a piece of jewelry, but a thick, worn file folder. She sat down beside Amelia and opened it on the kitchen table. Inside were bank statements, stock certificates, and portfolio summaries dating back nearly 25 years. "When your father died," Eleanor began, her voice quiet and steady, "his life insurance policy was the only thing of real value he had to leave us. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. I never touched a penny of it for myself. I lived on my nurse's salary, and every month I took a small portion of it and added it to what your father left. I gave it to a financial advisor, a kind, sensible man, and told him to make it grow, slowly and safely." Amelia stared at the documents, at the numbers that represented a lifetime of quiet, disciplined sacrifice. It was a sum that wouldn't buy a fraction of the Croft mansion, but it was more than enough to build a life. It was a foundation. It was security. It was freedom. "This was never my money," Eleanor continued, placing her hand over her daughter's. "It was your father's final gift, and I was just its keeper. I was saving it. Not for a wedding or a car or a down payment. I was saving it for a rescue. I always kept a road home open for you, Amelia, just in case you ever got lost." Amelia looked at her mother, at this woman of infinite patience and quiet strength, and finally understood the true nature of love. It was not about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was about the silent, steadfast act of keeping a light on in the window, year after year, just in case your child needed to find their way home in the dark. A year later, the apartment was filled not with silence, but with the joyful, chaotic sounds of a happy toddler. Lily, surrounded by unwavering love and security, had blossomed. She was a bright, giggling, curious child, her early trauma a forgotten dream. Amelia was transformed. She had found a part-time job curating a small, local art gallery, a position that paid little but filled her with a sense of purpose she had never known. The haunted, hollow look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a warm, confident light. She had rediscovered her own smile, her own laugh, her own soul. Her life was small and simple, and it was exquisitely, breathtakingly beautiful. True justice, it turns out, is rarely a lightning bolt of vengeance. More often, it is the slow, quiet, inevitable sunrise that follows a long, dark night. It is the natural consequence of truth being reintroduced into an ecosystem of lies. One should never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long. For 5 years, Eleanor's silence had been a vessel for her pain, a quiet testament to her own perceived irrelevance. But when she finally acted, her action was not one of revenge, but of rescue. And in that simple, loving act, the entire rotten structure of her daughter's life came crashing down. The real wealth was never in the Crofts' bank vaults. It was here, in this small, sunlit kitchen, in the scent of baking cookies, in the sound of a child's laughter, and in the unbreakable, resilient love that had waited patiently, in the silence, to finally bring its children home. Thank you for listening. We invite you to join us next time as we explore another story of the secrets, sorrows, and strengths that lie hidden within the heart of the family.